stuff. Alexis, take it away.
Thank you so much. So as he said, I work at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. If you're not familiar with that is, it's a US-based nonprofit, but we are international as well, that works on digital rights. We think your rights should come with you when you go online. And we've been around for 35 years now. So we've been around mostly since the internet has been public, and have some pivotal cases. We have a lot of legal people and representatives on our team and lawyers. And we have activism, and we also work from the technological aspect for building tools, and that's the team that I'm on. So I'm on the public interest technology team, and I've been at EFF for about 7 years now, actually. And so today I want to talk about short-lived certificates. I do mean TLS certificates when I say that. So if I keep saying certificates and you hear that, I mean transport layer security. I will do my best to make cryptography in its alphabet soup understandable and digestible. It's so if you feel like you get lost in some of the terms and jargon, there's a lot of resources where you can let it sink in. It took me about 2 years really to understand and grok everything about the ecosystem and memorize all these acronyms. So I will definitely try to guide that journey if you're not familiar. Why am I talking about this right now? So encrypting the web is kind of my thing. Electronic Frontier Foundation, we had an initiative that popped up around 2013 when Edward Snowden, out of the United States government, he was a former NSA employee or National Security Agency employee that revealed that the NSA was spying on American citizens, which is considered mostly a legal act. They weren't supposed to spy on American citizens. And so he had revealed that a lot of that was happening, some of the campaigns that were involved, and depending on who you talk to in the US, he's either a treasonous villain or a hero, depending on who you speak with. Mostly in the privacy community, he's considered a hero for what he did, for revealing this aspect of the NSA, and the Electronic Frontier Foundation actually sued the NSA over this. And it was an ongoing case around, I want to say it lasted about 10 years or so. And seeing that happen out of that campaign, out of the revelations that Edward Snowden came with, the big issue is that a lot of the internet and a lot of the web was unencrypted or in the clear. So HTTP was the rule of the day, and a lot of the web was able to be seen in terms of activity of submitted passwords, people who use any sort of contact forms, banking information, anything you submitted to a form online or even communicated with on web servers online were very easily tracked, very easily spied on because of the fact that it was unencrypted. So we came up with the Encrypted Web Initiative at EFF, and it began with a few projects. And some of those projects include Certbot. So Certbot, if you have used it before, it is a Acme client. What does Acme mean? It's an automated certificate management environment. So it automates getting web security certificates for your web servers and securing that and creating an environment where you can easily set that up as a web administrator or a system administrator or what have you, anyone who manages web servers. So you have Certbot that uses the Acme protocol. We helped develop this in tandem with other foundational partners with the Encrypted Web Initiative to have some sort of protocol, because before then there wasn't, to automate these certificates. I don't know how many people in here remember the days of configuring TLS without automation, but it was pretty painful. I remember struggling with a lot of virtual host files and Apache. It was not fun. I hated it. And I'm glad that this tool is here. So I actually used Certbot before I took on the Certbot project around 2016. So Acme, Certbot, and then also Let's Encrypt was the foundation that has these certificates. So being able to provide TLS certificates for free was also considered novel because TLS before then was mostly not free. So all this together made the Encrypted Web Initiative, and that's why I'm talking more about this today. But I also want to talk about the benefits of modern TLS tools and how it can help you if you're a security engineer, an aspiring security engineer, incident handler, any of those factions, network administration, how this ecosystem could kind of help you and aid you, and especially in terms of like incident response and anything that can happen with compromise with your org. And so Certbot today, we actually manage around 29 million certs for different servers around the world. And at this point, it's internet infrastructure and has become so for many, many web administrators out there. I apologize in advance for the alphabet soup that is public key cryptography. There's a lot of terms I'm going to say. Like I said, you might not have all this sink in today if you're not familiar with this world. I've been in it for some time. So unfortunately, for better or for worse, all of this is memorized, including the RFC numbers for every last one of these protocols. And I am just in that now. So whether or not that's beneficial, hopefully it is. It just spins around in my mind at night. So certificate authority is mainly the one term that you want to take away today, right? So certificate authorities or CAs are the ones that issue these certs. And there's many CAs around the world. You have governmental CAs, you have private CAs mostly, and they issue certificates for web servers. A lot of people end up using Let's Encrypt, which is the certificate authority that EFF helped found, which is a foundation. So it's not considered a private company. It's not considered a government entity. It's more considered a foundation and a nonprofit style entity that helps issue these TLS certificates with the guise of being able to provide TLS for free. That was the main initiative and goal there. A lot of these other terms, if you're familiar with the term SSL, TLS is the updated way to say that. HTTPS, you're probably familiar with URI schemes, right? And then you have root stores. And so every root store that is in your phone or your browser, there is a static list kept of all the trusted certificate authorities, right? And for a while, it was really up to the browser or your device management, such as like iOS or Android, whoever was kind of controlling that operating system. It was left up to them which certificate authorities to trust. But now, thankfully, most are managed by something called a root store program. They all decided to come together, have a consensus on what type of certificate authorities are trusted, rather than arbitrarily deciding which CAs are trusted and which ones are not, because it creates discrepancies between systems. It can create issues when you're trying to connect. So having root store programs is not only something that helps keep things consistent, but transparent and accountable, because since a lot of these things are run by private companies, you can't necessarily always trust one private company to make the best decisions. So having a consensus like the root store program is beneficial in that way too. I'm also going to talk about certificate transparency, something that is going to come up a lot in terms of being able to talk about accountability and be able to talk about validating the certificates that get issued within these systems by certificate authorities. And there's other couple down here too. I talk about OCSP. I won't talk about them as much because they're on their way out the door. So that's a great thing. OCSP was horrible, and OCSP pinning was horrible. And so I'm not going to talk about them as much because they're on the way out the door anyway, but it is something to know about. Historically, it's still in play, but Let's Encrypt, for example, as a certificate authority, has ended OCSP support as of this month. So that shows you kind of, it's on its way out the door, but it's a term you should know. And then you have certificate revocation lists, which, the recipe's in the name, a list of certificates that have been revoked and mostly monitored by the relevant parties that need to know this, especially certificate authorities, especially servers that have certificates that have been revoked, and how do they communicate with them. And I'll talk about that actually later. And then the last one is certificate and browser forum, certificate authority and browser forum, CAB. CAB is very big. CAB is where all the certificate authorities and browsers sort of talk together about how do they have baselines for issuing certificates, their auditing programs, what does that look like to be accountable, their reporting process. All of that is dictated by CAB. And it's supposed to kind of act as a check and balance, especially for those concerned with like American powers kind of like superseding the system. And so other entities that have their own guidelines, such as like entities out of Europe and such, being able to dictate what is a part of the guidelines when you do issue certificates and what standards should they adhere to. So, like I said, you don't have to take in everything, but this is most of the jargon that I'll be touching. And if you didn't let it all sink in the past 5 minutes that I'm talking, that's completely fine. It took me 2 years to get this all in my head. So just wanted to go over that. Is that the next slide? It is the next slide. Okay, so short timeline of related events for certificate lifetimes. So certificate lifetimes, how long does the certificate exist? Traditionally, 1 to 3 years. That's a long time considering the type of incidents that we have today and thinking about the lifetimes of breaches that we are aware of today and how often they happen to people now. 1 to 3 years is a long time. And then 2011, DigiNotar, a Dutch certificate authority, had a really major breach of their intermediate key. So in the chain of trust, you have the root certificate authority, you have an intermediate, and so the intermediate often issues a lot of these certificates with their intermediate key. And if you violate that chain of trust and you're able to compromise the intermediate, you're still able to issue some possible rogue certificates that may not be authorized to issue. So DigiNotar had their intermediate key compromised. And then I'm skipping over a lot of events in between these months, but these are relevant in terms of what I'm talking about as useful tools. So in 2011, Google Chrome, one of the entities that was impacted by DigiNotar, was thinking about how to impact post compromise of a key. So they introduced something called perfect forward secrecy. Without getting into the cryptography, perfect forward secrecy allows you to be able to still have encrypted sessions in the past with, even though that key has been compromised. So if I have a key, I'm not able to go decrypt previous sessions, and that's perfect forward secrecy in the best way I can explain. So they made that required in Chrome, and then other browsers followed suit. November 2015, Let's Encrypt, the certificate authority that I'm affiliated with, launches. 2015, we had free TLS certificates, 90-day times, and there was a lot of discontent from the certificate authorities that did not want to adhere to 90 days. They were like, that's too short. There's no way we can do that. This is not feasible. And there was a lot of kicking and screaming and gnashing of teeth. And a lot of people wanted to keep the 1 to 3 year lifetimes. But Let's Encrypt felt that 90 days, considering what happened between these 2 points in time, 4 years later after DigiNotar, they felt that this was required. This is something that should happen because of the fact that these compromise times are so long if you get these keys. And if you skip forward 10 years, finally, in the CAB forum, it has been agreed upon that short-lived certificates should exist. And Apple proposed a 47-day lifetime that will eventually be adhered to. It's not something that's required right now, but in the next few years, people are going to start winding down their certificate lifetimes to 47 days. It seems arbitrary of a number, but there is math behind that as to what, it's like a cascading thing and about how to respond and revocation times. You can look it up. But 47 days is what Apple's proposal was, and it was accepted in the CAB forum. And then if you skip ahead to January 2025 of this year, this is flipped. January 2025 was supposed to be first, but 6-day certificates and IP address certificate options from Let's Encrypt. So we are now issuing, by end of this year, 6-day certificates. And there's a lot of gnashing of teeth and screaming about that as well. But for the most part, that is what was agreed upon for a very particular reason. The under 10 days is very significant. So I want to talk about what happened with DigiNotar and why that incident was so key and the security aspects around that and what happened to them. So once again, the Dutch Certificate Authority, they were doing daily audits. They detected in June that there was a breach of their systems, and there was compromise with their intermediate certificate key. Then July 2011, the attackers, I forget their names, but the group that had this key, they were able to finally issue, they were doing a lot of tries. They were able to finally issue a rogue google.com wildcard certificate. That is immensely horrible. So that impacts anything under google.com domain. And during this time, there was detected attack within a lot of certificates and a lot of, cause what you can do with something like this is intercept traffic if you have ownership of this key. So there was interception of traffic on a high end in Iran. So you had Iran, you had a lot of traffic coming through these rogue certificates there, and there was an MITM or a man in the middle attack or a machine in the middle attack happening actively in Iran in July 2011 because of this compromise. And they weren't the only ones after they did a lot of incident response and investigation where I think it was Yahoo, Mozilla, and a few other major services were able to get rogue certificates signed and issued with this compromised key. And then July 27th, an online certificate status protocol request was issued for rogue google.com, and people were starting to see these OCSP requests come through in the browser level. Only until August 2011, this certificate was revoked because the certificate process for revocation is often flaky, long, and manual. And this was during a time of more manual management of these certificates. And then September 2011, they filed for bankruptcy. The reputation was done. They're being able to access someone's intermediate key and also issue rogue services for these major companies. So their reputation was done. So they shut down as a certificate authority. And that's additional to our incident. And that's why people talked about shorter-lived certificates and thinking about how 1 to 3 years is a little too long for something to live and be compromised. So why are short-lived certificates a good thing? Hopefully you kind of see why they're a good thing by now, but I'll explain it a little bit more. So if a private key is compromised, a compromise can't happen as long. So if you have a 6-day cert that you were able to have a rogue issue for, you wouldn't be able to really act within past that 6-day span. Shorter lifespans for certificates, obviously manual management of the many certificates that probably some of you touch every day, probably in the hundreds, probably in the thousands, especially if you're, you have some sort of SOC that you manage or something like that, that it's manually managing that is infeasible. So automation is very much encouraged with shorter lived certs. So it kind of forces the company to manage automated certificates rather than go with the manually managed route. And like I said, certificate revocation is historically flaky and sometimes unreliable. Sometimes browsers take time to update. Sometimes other systems take time to update their system stores of whether or not a certificate authority was completely taken out or whether or not the certificates were revoked. It takes time for all systems around the world to kind of catch up around that. And manually managing that process adds even more cruft and time and paperwork and communication. So lifetimes 10 days and under also allow you to bypass the revocation process because I brought up the 10 days and under for a reason. You don't actually need to use OCSP or CRLs if you have shorter lived certificates of 10 days and under. So while there is continued usage of a compromised key in this 10-day span, possibly, you won't have to deal with it after that span, and you won't have to go through the revocation process. Yes, CRLs are considered better than OCSP since OCSP is now starting to wind down. It's still not very reliable. So being able to avoid having to go through the revocation process of a continued compromised key while you're doing incident response is very, very beneficial. You can now split them out in two, and you don't have to deal with them simultaneously of a compromised key in a while and find out months later that this key was continued to be used to issue more rogue certs under your company's profile and name and domain control. You can now worry about that for maybe a couple days, which is still a worry, right? But now you're able to actually continue with incident response and triage of what was impacted within that couple days span versus DigiNotar dealt with it for 2 months. Now imagine going through an incident response event of 2 months of that scale. That is way more stressful to manage, right? So possibly being able to skip a step during incident response is probably for the best for your team's mental health and also for the company's reputation. And so I'm going to play devil's advocate with myself because there's a lot of concerns around shorter-lived certs that do pop up, and I do want to address those. So some people will say that 6 days is too short. Some people issue certificates for a day. Sometimes there's day certificates, there's 24-hour certificates, and some people from different entities may say that's too short and that it's unmanageable, that having that many certificates being issued at one time, whereas you had the one certificate for 1 to 3 years for a service, now you have multiple potentially. That is a concern. There was something about race conditions and time clocks around something short as like 24 hours and being able to hit that potentially of that race condition. There are definitely more certificates that system administrators would have to keep track of. Yes. And legacy systems. A lot of legacy systems are not updated with the latest software to be able to handle automation, to be able to handle Acme protocol, or even have the ability to update. Maybe you work in the medical field. Maybe you work for an outdated financial infrastructure. And my main answer for most of that is automation. You're going to have to move towards automation. Manually trying to do any of this is absurd. Manually trying to do any of this will cause your team way more stress. It will take more resources from that standpoint if you're doing it manually. But if you're doing this with automation, no, that will not cause a factor of 2 or 3 or 4 times the work. You have to move towards automation to actually address these concerns. And it's up to you. And there are tools that I will mention later that help you kind of decide whether or not how short you want to go for a certificate, or do you want to keep it for the traditional 90 days now. So I'm going to talk about the new tools that we have with shorter-lived certificates soon, but I'm also going to address the timeline of how DigiNotar could have went differently. So the intermediate CA key was compromised, like I said, detected via audit. But in July 2011, when this rogue Google.com certificate was issued, the attackers would have just had about like 6 days to act. I'm going under the 6-day model from Let's Encrypt. Whether or not that they were able to pull this off in that time with the Iran MITM attack might not have happened at all, considering that they had only 6 days to act. They might have need to actually come with a shorter campaign or shorter lived campaign. Whether or not the other targets could have happened is in question as well, since the other targets like Yahoo, Mozilla, and others that were getting rogue certificates issued as well, this attack could have been stopped from there if they only had a week to act, really, or less than a week. So this definitely shortened the time that attackers would have had to escalate. It would have shortened the time they had to identify more targets within the system with the compromised key. They would have only had the certificate for a short amount of time because they wouldn't be able to retrieve the key, because by this time they were already booted out the system anyway. The intermediate key was getting rotated, so it would have been pretty useless. But since they had the key and the key lasts so long, they were able to keep issuing these certificates. And then by this point, at the end of July, the ongoing attack would have ended. This is all obviously speculation, but from the 6-day model, the incident response would have continued, but the ongoing attack and the breadth of and scope of this attack possibly could have been limited if it was 6 days. The certificate, I think, that they were issuing was about 1 to 3 years or 1 to 2 years, I believe. It was under the traditional model. So if they would have had a shorter lived certificate, they wouldn't have been able to have such a breadth of campaign or a wide scope. And beyond July 27th, most of this OCSP would not have been done or requested because shorter-lived certs don't even interact with that. The campaign wouldn't have been able to go towards August 2011. Revocation process wouldn't have been needed because the certificate would have already expired in 6 days. So you wouldn't have need to go through that process. And considering the manual nature of revocation and longer lived certificates, they had to do that process. But if they would have had a 6-day cert, that would have ended. And I don't know, DigiNotar could have maybe avoided bankruptcy, maybe not, who knows, depending on the reputation scope. Would they just had the 6-day cert and then the google.com certificate, which is a major breach, right? But it would have been in the 6-day scope versus the 2-month scope that happened here, where the attackers were able to escalate and issue more rogue certificates for more services that impacted millions and also help sponsor a government-run campaign. And so the key takeaways from short key compromise times is that and how did you know TAR could have went differently. It's better triage if they could have helped, been able to like shorten the scope, right? If they could have been able to shorten the scope of impact, that would have been preserving possibly their reputation at that point if they were able to do that. And it also would have helped let their teams be able to understand, within that scope, what is happening in terms of certificate transparency and others that I will talk about later. But short key compromise is much better than 1 to 3 years. So that's just math there at that point. Modern TLS and automation allows for other ways to take inventory what is in scope of your network. So if you actually are using modern TLS and these tools along with shorter list certificates, you're actually able to do a lot of inventory along the way and proactive inventory, proactive investigation on possibly issued certs that are rogue or not authorized or look suspicious. Or even services and networks that you may have forgotten about. That does happen a lot with us. That's something I think a lot of people don't want to admit. Sometimes it's like, oh, I forgot about that service or that service was running. And these modern tools will help you actually be able to put that in scope and be able to investigate things like that. Short-lived certificates and CT logs. So certificate transparency logs, there is a history. Certificate transparency logs are mostly run by major companies as volunteers. So Cloudflare, for instance, runs a certificate transparency log. There's one run by Sectago, which is actually a certificate authority. And there's a couple others that are out there. But traditionally, certificate transparency logs are based off like SQL database structures and such. And considering how many certificates are out there now and are stored, that wasn't the best storage structure going forward. There was something that was happening a lot with like Let's Encrypt, for instance, also runs a CT log. Running these logs takes a lot of resources, takes a lot of work, takes a lot of money. And when you have archaic structures holding this amount of data, they had to think fast on how to keep this up because certificate transparency logs are only as good as their uptime. And if they're always falling down and they're always having downtime, or there's discrepancies, it makes certificate transparency kind of useless in a sense because you're not able to have the consistency and wide availability that CT logs should be providing. So they had to think about it. So different companies took different approaches. Let's Encrypt partnered with another cryptographer that's in the field that works on cryptography assurance actually at the Go project at Google. And they worked on something called Sunlight, which actually brings more modern infrastructure of storage with CT logs. So being able to use things like Merkle trees and tiling and being able to store certificate information on better formatted types of storage that are able to be, I would say, spoken to or requested to in a manner that's fast, but also being able to store this information on millions and millions of certificates that are out there in a better way, and also being able to use things like cloud storage. So before, when you had CT logs stored on things like SQL-based databases, it wasn't very reliable or usable within cloud structures. So now people are able to use AWS or Azure or other cloud-based infrastructures to actually create some sort of redundancy and reliability globally with CT logs, rather than depending on their own infrastructure and running these CT logs and having them topple over on themselves. So older storage formats, they're actually being phased out as we speak. I know Sectago moved on to their updated structure. Let's Encrypt has moved on to Sunlight. And now we have Tessera CT from Google. You may have known them as Trillion. Trillion from Google was the original format, and now they have Trillion Tessera, which is based off Merkle trees and that structure. I won't get into what Merkle trees are, but if you're familiar with them, they're a much better structure than what they were having before. So new implementations allow for better storage mechanisms and higher uptimes and be able to have reliable CT logs. That doesn't solve our problem completely because people meaning in folks within this ecosystem are a little worried about short-lived certificates and how many of them that will exist in the future and how these CT logs, even the new ones, might hold up against storing that amount of information. But it's a conversation of like whether or not they are able to actually do things like, use AWS Glacier, for instance, for like long-term storage formats. It's a matter of being able to store the much more information that we have from billions more people on the planet and many more certificates to come. And it's going to be an ongoing scaling problem for them. But thankfully for now, they do have a much better storage format, and hopefully CT logs will be more resilient over time. Proactive protection in CT logs. I want to say that I can't emphasize enough how useful CT logs can be for security engineers and network administration. It's a free tool that you have at your disposal as a team. This is not something you have to sign up for. It's not something that you have to have a subscription for or get a vendor license or any of those things to be able to use. CT logs can help locate forgotten or neglected services within your system if you're querying for them. They help monitor phishing attacks. If you're monitoring domains that are alike to yours, using those types of services with like DNS and everything, and you're just like, well, this seems like a campaign that is targeting my organization. And you can use CT logs to see what kind of certificates they're issuing and what domains are they stretching towards and trying to emulate from your infrastructure. So it can actually help monitor phishing attacks, of suspicious domains that you're looking at and track campaigns potentially of others and maybe alert others within the ecosystem, like, hey, they issued a certificate under a very suspicious domain that's related to us, and being able to communicate within security teams. I think our best bet is communication, and our best selves are having community-based aspects towards security engineering, because doing it by yourself in a silo, you're not going to do too well. I think sharing of information and sharing what you're seeing is way more important than it has ever been. Monitoring third-party vendors as well, I think, is also what CT logs can help with as well, because if you're issuing certificates for services that vendors are touching, CT logs can kind of help you see if there's anything going on at that level as well, especially if you gave them some sort of domain control of subdomains. If you see some sort of activity happening with a third-party vendor, you can start to do some proactive research on, your partners and reconfigure, like, what does that relationship mean? If they have too much access, if there's campaigns targeting your vendors, maybe you'll be able to catch it and tell them, and be able to also protect your systems with CT logs. So I can't emphasize enough how CT logs can help you. There's different ones out there. A lot of people like to use CRT.sh. CRT.sh is, I think, run by Sectigo, but that's the one that seems to be the most popular with a lot of like my administration friends. But there are other CT logs you can use, but CRT.sh is something that is readily available, and Cloudflare, I believe, has a service as well, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But there are many out there that you can use in your tool set. I'll talk about another tool. So before, with certificate authorities and revocation, moving away from the responsibility of the person that has the certificates and on to the responsibility of a certificate authority. Sometimes certificate authorities mess up and they misissue certificates, and they have to revoke a batch of certificates. And sometimes that impacted you. Sometimes that impacted your organization and your service, because you suddenly had revoked certificates for a service that needed to have a certain SLA. And that's not, beneficial to your team, and it causes confusion. And if you needed a certain amount of uptime for your services, then, and having revoked certificates can impact that and whether or not they stay online. So they came up with Acme Renewal Information API. So Let's Encrypt has started to support this, and Certbot is actually adding support for ARI as we speak, where the certificate authority is able to automate the process of batch renewals and batch revocation and things of that nature, and be able to do it in a staggered way. So that way it doesn't do everything at once. One, it helps them too, because if they're doing batch revocation, it can hit their systems as well and cause downtime. But ARI also helps people who have the certificates be able to have some sort of alert system in place when things need to be renewed faster than normal. So if you have a 90-day certificate, normally renewal will hit around 60 days. Renewal flag will hit around 60 days. But now with ARI, and you needed it renewed faster than that due to some sort of incident, maybe on part of the certificate authority, maybe on part of you, they're able to use the ARI to actually be able to stagger that out and be able to give some sort of heads up on being able to stagger renewals and revocation, and making the process as easy as getting the certificate in the first place. Before, they had to email you. Whether or not you saw the email in time that revocation was happening was variable, and there's a lot of manual communication. But now it doesn't have to be manual. It can be an automated process as well. So ARI is cool. Not everybody is supporting it right now, but it is becoming a part of a lot of Acme clients, including the one that I run, Certbot. And so this reduces service downtime. I think that's like the biggest takeaway there for you as someone who would run these services and have these certificates on these services. You would need to know, how long are my systems going to be down because of this process? And thankfully with ARI, much shorter. So I was talking about before about legacy systems. Legacy systems may not always have Acme involved. Legacy systems may not need a day cert or a 6-day cert. And you may want to provision different types of services for different lifespans for certificates. So we have something now called Acme profiles. This is also rolling out by end of year. We actually already added it to Certbot, but Let's Encrypt, I think in particular, will roll it out as a supported feature in the future by end of year. And other certificate authorities, I suspect, will start supporting Acme profiles. So now you'll have the ability to choose either classic certificate support, lifespans like 90 days, or if you have like IoT systems that need to be rotated a little bit faster, you can choose shorter lived profiles, 6 days, and be able to actually have that as well. So if you have TLS systems that's like, I don't need to have 6 days on these particular sets of services, I can have it at 90 days and be okay. And you're okay with that risk threshold, you can choose that. So we don't want to force people on 6 days. It's just a matter of being able to accommodate more systems like IoT devices that do need to be rotated faster than normal, due to their expansive nature, due to how many that exist in general, and being able to accommodate what other profiles that may be in your organization that you feel like either need shorter lifetimes or should be able to stay within the 90-day realm. And if you want 1 to 2, 3 years longer, I mean, Let's Encrypt doesn't support that, but there are other certificate authorities I imagine will have other Acme profiles as well that you can choose when you spin up these services to automate TLS certificates. So it provides flexibility. That is the takeaway of Acme profiles, flexibility for how long you want your certs to live. And so I have a final note on internal PKI. Some of you may be running internal systems of public key infrastructure internally and not necessarily having web or public facing services that you manage the keys for and certificates for. So a lot of people will complain like, hey, I can't really necessarily run Acme on these legacy systems that are internal. They're old. I have these old medical devices. Even if you don't issue shorter lived certificates, visibility is much better than resignation. Being able to have a visibility on what's going on within your systems, if you're using some of these tools, certificate transparency is required now for public facing services, maybe making it required for internal facing services as well, even if they're old or not. Being able to have that visibility helps you as a team, especially if you're a 1 to 2 person team, which I come across a lot in different systems where there's only 2 security engineers on staff, where there's only a couple that are able to do anything about the systems that they have, and being able to have numbers, being able to actually be able to do inventory and have visibility on your systems is much better than just resigning yourself to, well, these are old. I can't do anything about them. I can't use these tools. You can use some of these tools, despite the fact you may not be able to use Acme. Visibility, like I said, better than resignation. Usually more security issues are involved with legacy systems than just lack of automation. So if you have systems that are still existing that can't update to some of these tools, you do have more problems than just automation. That's a noise coming in. But either way, being able to assess why you can't update also helps, and be able to actually have a framework around and a goal around updating is also beneficial. So being able to say, hey, certificate lifetimes, we can't update to this, and we can't shorten our compromise times because these systems can't update because of X, Y, and Z. Being able to articulate that and advocate for yourselves and get resources from your organization, whether or not you feel like it will work or not, like I said, having that visibility, having that know-how, having that argument is being able to empower yourselves on possibly hashing out next steps on updating your internal systems. Backups. I cannot stress enough about backups. Please keep backups of everything that you have. Back up your keys, rotate your keys, please back up things. I've come across so many security organizations and people that do not back up things. And I usually have had to come in and do the backups because I was like, hey, we have this service that we sign in the air gap server in a military grade safe. That's cool. Where are the backups? And usually I get crickets. Please back up your systems. If anything you take away from this, back up your systems, please. Legacy systems, whether or not you have old keys, I don't care. You have an RSA key that's 10 years old. Please back it up. Back up your keys. So that's all I'm going to ask for now. Security hardware has more variety now. So a lot of you may have dealt with HSMs or hardware security modules. HSMs, if anybody's ever dealt with one, kind of sucks. I don't really know how else to say that in a better and eloquent way. HSMs have historically been hard to obtain. They're expensive. HSMs can run you from $600, which is considered on the cheap end for an HSM and up. And there was a lot of management around HSMs that are with proprietary software of whoever you got it from. Normally a certificate authority, normally from others as well, but mostly affiliated with certificate authorities. I remember getting an HSM in a plain white envelope in the mail one time with a clear password and an email for it. So not the best management. But thankfully today we have better options around HSMs for internal PKI especially. So we have cloud-based HSMs. So all the major cloud services have them. Azure, GCP, AWS, they have some sort of management around customer keys versus dedicated hardware keys. Dedicated hardware keys are more expensive. Customer keys are less expensive. Please remember that. Your billing may be high if you start tapping into dedicated hardware keys. So just be cognizant of that. Security keys too, I found to be very beneficial to replace a lot of HSM functions. So like, I love YubiKeys. I don't like PKCS11 as a standard for them. And I won't get into the alphabet soup of that, but basically talking to the hardware keys can be its own thing and what software you use for that. But I like security keys because they often are able to replace a lot of the functionality internally that I needed to sign things, to be able to have some sort of internal PKI that makes sense, that is scalable and easily revocable. Because I can manage a physical key from my engineers and being able to rotate that, being able to manage the keys that way versus a really expensive HSM that you have to re-provision and use proprietary software for. And use internal tools that support Acme. I can't stress that enough. I don't usually put vendors out there but I do like Small Step CA. I do like them a lot. If you have internal PKI, looking up things like Small Step CA and others as well. I know there are others that exist, but if you have internal PKI systems, looking those things up that support Acme is very important. And that is my talk. That is what I have for now in terms of modern TLS tools at your disposal and why it's important to you as a security engineer and why you should use them today. And thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alexis, for kickstarting the day with a really compelling talk. Before I lay you off the lectern, though, any questions from the floor? Great. Let me just pass the mic over. Had to be on the last row.
Yeah, can you talk about the how organizations might mitigate the added cost, either from a compute or financial perspective, of the shortened certificate lifetimes? Is that something that EFF is bearing? Is that something that the ACME certificate authorities are bearing? Is it something that the organizations bear?
Well, in terms of cost, it shouldn't have that high of like a factor when it comes to if you have automation in place already. And if you're already going by 90-day certificate lifespans already, and especially if you're using Let's Encrypt, a lot of people do, it's just a matter of being more cognizant of which systems and services may be impacted by the change. And I think that change may come with a cost, but over time, long term, it shouldn't expand any bills in any way. But there could be some sort of impact of change, especially with like SLAs. Being able to keep uptime on things and being able to understand which services may be impacted by the change when you move over to a shorter lived certificate profile. That is the best answer I have for that. Cool.
Cool. Thank you. Any other questions? We have a couple of minutes left. In any case, Alexis, you'll be around at the conference floor throughout the day. So if you have any questions, feel free to approach her directly. Again, Alexis, thank you very much for kickstarting our conference this year.